Good evening, this is Mae Brussel. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 806, May the 18th, 1986. Before I get into the material, because then I move pretty quickly, I want to remind you that if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope, I will send you bibliography sheets of these programs so that you can have the information that I'm discussing and the location of the articles or books that you can refer to go further into this material. Some of this I have to go pretty quickly because there's so much news that's just pouring out, and the rest you can look up at your libraries yourself. The U.S. Navy ship was hit in the Gulf this weekend, and of course Ronald Reagan is, in quotes, watching it very seriously, and George Shultz is commenting on the news about the seriousness of this event. Now that Gary Hart is off the news for the past 2 weeks, and we're ready for week 3 of testimony and hearings, I believe that this is another great diversionary of the Reagan administration to illustrate how important his agents were in the Middle East with that strategic location and how we need intelligence and that they were working with people behind the lines. This great diversionary will go down in history as the Gulf of Tonkin, excuse for Lyndon Johnson to get us embroiled further into the Vietnamese War, or the Berlin disco bombing, which was set up for the purposes of having an excuse to bomb Gaddafi, hope to kill him, and bomb Libya, all arranged, of course, by Admiral Poindexter, Oliver North, and their little team. There was an article in these Times, March the 18th, by Alexander Coburn, and he describes just the way the Reagan administration and those before him and those going all the way back to Adolf Hitler create their excuses for things that can follow later. In this article, he says that there was a November 28th story from a Mexican newspaper, Excelsior, headed, U.S. proposed to Costa Rica to start war with Nicaragua. The Costa Rican ambassador to Mexico, Angel Edmundo Solano, was Minister of Public Security in his country between 1982 and 1984. He said, when I was minister one day, Curtin Windsor, the U.S. ambassador, came to visit and to tell me it was time to extirpate the cancer, the Sandinistas being the cancer in Nicaragua. The best thing would be to contrive a maneuver whereby Costa Rica would be attacked by members of a supposed former army, which he knew perfectly well would be a disguised army of Contra provocateurs. Costa Rica would then denounce this act of aggression and invoke the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance so that U.S. could go into action. Ambassador Solano said that when he turned down the idea, Windsor departed, and thereafter he, Solano, was the target of a ferocious smear campaign, was forced to resign August 31st, 1984. And Alexander Coburn goes on to say that discussing the cancer of Nicaragua, or George Shultz saying Nicaragua is a cancer we must cut out, which he told an audience at Kansas State University, he may have not known, or he may, that he was quoting Adolf Hitler almost to the word on the day they attacked Poland. The rest of the remarks sounded like Hitler also, in quotes, negotiations are a euphemism for capitulation if the shadow of power is not cast across the bargaining table. Now, we had this same call for help, allegedly very badly needed when Maurice Bishop was killed in Grenada. That gave the excuse for the Americans to come over, take over that island, and that was 1983. So in 1984, we wanted to be called into action to save people again against this terrible aggression, and it would be the very people that we were funding and training that would be the excuse for our actions in getting rid of that cancer in Central America. The Vatican had a quotation in their newspaper this week, a response to an anthropologist, Brunetta Chiarelli, a professor at the University of Florence. The professor was saying that it would be possible with genetic work now to make an ape man. Ape men could be bred to carry out menial tasks and provide or transplant organs. And the Vatican is objecting that this is, in quotes, a satanic attempt to destroy every presence of God in the universe. It's interesting that the Vatican is objecting to these genetic experiments whereby an anthropologist said he could breed ape men in the laboratory by fertilizing a chimpanzee with human semen. The Vatican was helpful in assisting people like Joseph Mengele, the great genetic scientist, out of the country and into Argentina and then Sao Paulo, Brazil. building the route line for the likes of Klaus Barbie. So what goes around comes around, and in 1987, the geneticists who were trained or idealized as in the person of Joseph Mengele are trying to make animal persons for menial tasks. And just recently, I just mentioned briefly the plans to possibly genetically alter people's heads so that they make better pilots and stay awake and play around with their natural abilities. There's an article just briefly in the newspaper, not many papers, but in the Washington Times, and heard very quickly on ABC News a few weeks ago, about Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor for the Iran-Contra affair, and his links to the Southern Air Transport and the CIA airline. I only have from all of my newspapers one small article, and I want to share it with you in case you didn't hear it on your television stations. The title is Legal Job for CIA Front Performed by Walsh Firm. It says Lawrence Walsh, the independent counsel investigating the Iran-Contra scandal, independent, get that, belongs to an Oklahoma law firm that represented the CIA front company, the Southern Air Transport. This was first reported by KTOK Radio and Oklahoma Gazette, and they obtained bills of sales, and they showed other lawyers in the firm of Crowe and Dunleavy, the firm that Mr. Walsh belongs to, that handled the legal work in 1985 for Southern Air to purchase 3 Boeing 707s in 1985. Southern Air, once owned by the CIA, is now being investigated by Mr. Walsh himself, and his law firm handled the papers. Federal sources told ABC that 2 of the 3 planes purchased in 1985 from the CIA flew covert arms to the Middle East and landed in Iran. Mr. Walsh said he only learned of the Southern Air connection when reporters alerted him to it, and that he didn't share in any of the law firm's profits, and he noted the legal work involved was just routine transactions and the buying and selling of aircraft, and that Southern Air isn't a full-time client, and Southern Air, of course, is involved in taking arms down to the Contras. So he says, I didn't get any money, and they're only a part-time client. And then a member of the law firm, the same law firm of Crowe and Dunleavy, by the name of Richard Ford, is working with Mr. Walsh on the special prosecutor's staff. The New York Times had a description of some of the lawyers on the team of the Iran-Contra affair, and the first they described was Arthur Liman. He appeared the third day questioning General Secord. He's a graduate of Harvard College, Yale Law School, a partner in Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. And again, Rifkin set up the corporation papers for TCI that developed into Stanford Technology, and it describes him being attorney for Stephen Ross of Warner Communications, and Henry Kissinger is on the board of that, and they're attorneys for Henry Kissinger, and Robert Vesco, the financier, now a fugitive from justice, also Carl Icahn, the corporate raider. Lyman also worked for Nelson Rockefeller, investigating the Attica prison riots, and Mr. John Niels, the first attorney questioning Richard Secord on the stand, worked with the House Ethics Committee for 2 years investigating Korean influence peddling, and of course Reverend Moon, the subject of that material, who should have really been exposed further, was active with Klaus Barbie in Bolivia. He is the head of CAUSE, a group that funds the Contras, and he has headquarters throughout many countries in South America that have worked with the Nazis, the death squads, the P2, and so forth. Mr. Niels also helped prosecute Mark Feld and Edward Miller of the FBI for illegally breaking into homes, private homes, but they got off the hook also when the case was over. Now, starting next week, there's a gentleman, Robert Dutton, who's going to be on the stand, and he's described in the New York Times today as a potential gold mine. He is going to talk about the Contra supply efforts and the officials on the staff of Vice President George Bush. Now, the Sunday talk shows, the radio, television, the newspapers are going very gingerly on George Bush, who should have been removed immediately, quicker than it took to get Spiro Agnew at the time of Watergate. But they're going to lead up to Felix Rodriguez, which is one of the key parts of this whole story. Rodriguez met personally with Bush. He's admitted it now. Rodriguez wears the armband from the wristwatch of Che Guevara. He worked with Klaus Barbie and the Italian Nazi war criminal death squads. And I have described Bush as Killer Bush for a long, long time. So Dutton's testimony will be interesting. It's going to be considered very valuable, and he has gotten immunity to tell as much as the prosecutors want him to tell. One quick item, Congressman Howard Metzenbaum is going to have hearings in the Senate about the food NutraSweet, and I've warned about that or talked about it and should have done more about NutraSweet for a long time. NutraSweet allegedly has elevated levels of phenylalanine, which is linked to behavioral change and reduced attention span and loss of memory. I once read an article in the New York Times a while back on NutraSweet cutting the connective areas that are responsible for your remembering things, and these will be interesting hearings. I just insert this here so that people, if you still take NutraSweet and you're a World Watcher, get off of it. Good World Watchers need their memories to put these events together with things that we have heard in the past and go to the sources of the past. Douglas J. Feith, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, was talking to congressional committees about advanced biotechnology as a weapon, and this was August the 8th of this past year to the subcommittee of the House Select Committee, and I think I mentioned it before on World Watchers, I believe I did. He was talking about the stunning advances in pharmaceuticals, food, and fertilizer, and he mentioned NutraSweet as a weapon. It was in the testimony, but in the Washington Post and the San Francisco Chronicle, they published word for word what he said at the hearings on August the 8th, and the Washington Post and Chronicle left out the word NutraSweet, and that was published in Executive Intelligence Review, where the entire transcript of the hearings were mentioned, and the word NutraSweet was left in, and now members of Congress are going to look again into the fact of NutraSweet as a weapon and the fact that it can erase your memory. Now, I don't know how many of you are getting the hearings every day on the radio or on television. I quickly want to run down the main witnesses of the past 2 weeks because we get ready for week 3 starting tomorrow. The very first week, Major General Richard Secord was on the stand talking about his partnership with Albert Hakim, 50-50, into what he calls the Stanford Technology Trading Group, which came out of, and there's still offices in Los Gatos of Stanford Technology, that bought International Imaging System, a subsidiary of TCI set up by Otto von Bolschwing. He said they still have $8 million in the bank, $2 million is not accounted for. The second day, Major General Richard Secord was on the stand, and he also talked about the diversion of funds from Iran down to the Contras, and that he believed that Reagan was aware of this. He has no way of knowing, but Ollie North told him he knew. And North talked about a shredding party, which is brought up again with Robert McFarlane, destroying the records, and this is the day that William Casey died. On day 3, Richard Secord was asked about profits he made. He said he did this for the love of his country and that he wasn't in it to make money, and Arthur Liman was pressuring him about where the money went and the possibility that he had these profits, and Secord also said he thought he was carrying out the president's orders when he did these things. And then the mysterious money from the Sultan of Brunei was located that day. North had reversed a $6 and a $7 million, and the scandal of the money not being in the bank accounts has been going on for quite a long time. And then within a few days there was a bigger lie that a person mistakenly had the $10 million, and that his name hasn't been revealed, who he is or where he is. But it is very important to find out who got that $10 million, because when another deposit was made, it didn't dawn on him that he had too much. And just as they were referring to countries 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and now putting the names of the countries on the air, this committee is totally compromised in almost every sense of the word, and they're going to conceal the name of the person who got the money, but it may be somebody very important, and if it is, it will come out. There are enough investigators that will bypass the committee. The fourth day was Robert McFarlane, the second week of the hearings, a national security advisor, who explained how he resigns. And this is where the raw nerves of the system become more visible. Under General Secord, you saw his connections with Albert Hakim. They both owned the business. Hakim controlled the money, was taking care of it in the Swiss banks, and it went to Mr. Willard Zucker in Switzerland, and Secord would tell where to draw out the money. McFarlane, in quotes, when he leaves the NSC, he turns it over to Admiral Poindexter. Then he goes to his home, and the word resigns is like ex-CIA or ex-Defense Department. He gets an NSC computer. He meets almost daily with Oliver North, who's like his own son. He starts getting, North is working with Casey and getting information about where to travel and who to get money from the send arms to Iran and divert to the Contras. And he's beginning to make trips, Secord-McFarlane, to the Middle East. In May 1968, he made a trip to Iran. He made several of them. They weren't successful in getting the hostages out. But McFarlane is not salaried and on his own. Now, remember, Secord retired from the Air Force in 1983. And he connects with these people, and he's not salaried, and he's not on the books. And his name is on no piece of paper connected with TCI, or that becomes Stanford Technology Trading Group. They use all kinds of diversions to lose the tracks of where money comes from or who signs papers or orders. But the important thing is that McFarlane is, in quotes, former national security advisor while he works with the national security, doing things that even the NSC can't do. So on his own, he's supposed to be making these errands for Ronald Reagan and the powers that be. On day 5, Secord-McFarlane conceded that the National Security Council did give aid to the Contras. They violated the Bolton Amendment. He admitted he had not been truthful to congressional committees. He told them about his documents being shredded that Ollie North told him. And he also exposed the fact that Ronald Reagan was pleased with the donations from Saudi Arabia, which were $2 million a month to the Contras. And now Saudi Arabia wants some very expensive weapon. And the question is, did the president promise him these weapons in return for the donations to the Contras? What were the promises? Now, Gaston Sigur came on this past week. He's Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Public Affairs. He's a staff member of NSC. He's a professor at the Georgetown Center for Strategic International Studies. And then another country was brought in. He solicited $2 million from Taiwan for the Contras. Well, John Singlaub is very close to Taiwan with the World Anti-Communist League, and the China lobby of Chiang Kai-shek and that group set up the political network for Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. They are presidents that came out of the milieu of these organizations, and Gaston Sigur could go to that of Taiwan and get money for the Contras. The witness that followed Gaston Sigur was Robert Owen, and he'll be on the stand this week. And he was tremendously interesting, and I hope most of you got to hear his testimony. And I want to pick out a few key words that he talked about and share them with you. Robert Owen was a graduate of Stanford University. He was a former aide to John Quayle, Quale, of Indiana, a Republican. And he was liaison to the National Security Council and Oliver North to the Contras. Now, John Hull, the gentleman described in the Christic Institute suit, has property down in Costa Rica. He's lived there 20 years. He's a United States citizen from Indiana. And Robert Owen said his liaison with Hull had to do with Senator Dan Quayle in the first place and his familiarity with Hull down in Costa Rica. And Hull allegedly took over the property of Robert Vesco. Vesco living in Costa Rica through the Watergate years. He's now in Havana. But Vesco is the client of the chief prosecutor in this case, and like I mentioned before, and he's also the client and partner of Willard Zucker in Switzerland, who handles the money for the Iran-Contra affairs. So the offices of Arthur Liman represent Robert Vesco, and the bankers of this whole matter work with Robert Vesco. And Robert Vesco was in Costa Rica, moved to Havana, and Hull has that property. Vesco is also a partner with William Colby and Richard Allen in various ventures. Now, Owen became the courier for the National Security Council. He was working with Hull, who was writing the salaries for him, and he testifies about certain names that are maybe familiar to some and not to others, and I want to bring those out because in the description of the work he did going between Costa Rica and Washington, he mentioned that before he started working with Mr. Calero down in Costa Rica, that Robert Owen worked for Robert Keith Gray from the public relation firm, often referred to as the Powerhouse. Now, I always get new listeners that pick up along the way, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with Robert Keith Gray. His name surfaced at the time of the investigation and decision on whether Ed Meese should be Attorney General, because when Ed Meese needed money for his home and a job for his wife because he couldn't carry his financial obligations when he moved to Washington. It was Robert Keith Gray who intervened in the case of Edwin Meese and got his wife a job at American University and bailed Edwin Meese out. I will do more on Robert Keith Gray in a moment. The other name associated with the work of Robert Owen was Neil Livingstone, an employee of Gray Associates, and I'll tell you more about Livingstone. And then he said he also worked with John Singlaub. Singlaub, of course, is president of the World Anti-Communist League. He's on the board of directors of Western Goals. He works in the Defense Department. He's an advisor with the National Security Agency. He's one of the big wheels of the American Security Council. And he is also affiliated with Peregrine, the covert action group that hires guns, killers, out of Dallas, Texas. And I mentioned last week that his name was linked to Peregrine Company, set up by persons from the Defense Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, getting mercenaries out into the field of battle, and linked right up to the White House and to the Defense Department, to a General Wilson under Caspar Weinberger in the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, Owen testified on the stand last Friday that Singlaub took him to Colorado to meet Robert Brown of Soldier of Fortune. Well, Owen has ties, I say, to the Gray public relations firm and to Mr. Livingston, who's gung-ho to kill foreign leaders. That was his expertise. He had contacts with killers all over the world, this Livingstone, out of the Gray offices. And Robert Brown also was a person active in recruiting mercenaries. He still is. He has a magazine called Soldiers of Fortune and is active in recruiting people to assassinate and do coup d'etat in order to put the power in the hands of military dictatorships. John Singlaub is on the board of Western Goals. Philip Crane is on the board of Western Goals. And 2 weeks ago, I mentioned, or last week, 2 men were arrested going to kill Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. They were on their way there, and they had contacts with Philip Crane of Western Goals, who probably will deny it now, in Illinois. The stopping of these men with their $5 million to kill Ortega, I would guess, comes at a time when they don't want to be caught with their money tracing into the White House safes and the connections to the White House. This happened at the time of Watergate, when Richard Nixon was supposed to be killed, and a man named Andrew Topping from New York City was arrested, and the Secret Service came in, and the circumstances of the arrest implicate or suggest that the assassination plot couldn't be accomplished because the money would link to the bank of Bernard Barker and the Watergate defendants. So when they were arrested, the money was tied up, and I imagine the blowing of this case of the 2 guys from Oklahoma who were going to kill Ortega happens at a time when they don't want the money, to be the $5 million or whatever they would get, to be tied up with the killing of Ortega to the National Security Council. So during these hearings, you're getting a view of a network of people such as General Wilson of Peregrine Company, working in the White House and Defense Department's Caspar Weinberger, and private individuals like John Singlaub attached to Peregrine, and then John Singlaub working with Mr. Robert Owen and taking him up to Robert Brown's location in Colorado of Soldier of Fortune, where the Mercs are hired. Now, I have an interesting article on Neil Livingstone, the man who worked with Robert Owen, that he testifies that he worked with Robert Grays. This came out of the Salt Lake Tribune, Sunday, September 8th, 1986, and I want to give some highlights of this article about him and interject the material of the Iran-Contra affair and Robert Gray. The article says that Neil Livingstone and his wife live at the Watergate Hotel, and in one of the rooms of the apartment is decorated with death weapons, Czechoslovakian pistols, books on germ warfare. He calls himself an expert on counterterrorism. Counterterrorism is the biggest game, the fastest growing industry in America, he said. Livingstone advocates the assassination and the violent overthrow of governments. In quotes, "We should have killed the Ayatollah. As for Nicaragua, Somoza was a bad guy. These guys are worse." And just this past week, I mentioned the arrest of 2 people who were going into Nicaragua, were offered $5 million to kill Daniel Ortega. And Mr. Livingston said, "The right thing, in my judgment, is to overthrow the government. Whether the Contras or the U.S. should do it in Nicaragua, we must throw them out." And the background of Livingston is he grew up in Montana, went to high school there, studied for a degree at Fletcher School of Law, which he didn't get yet, went to the university in the 1970s. And this is Livingstone's mind, and he works with Owen, who works with Singlaub and World Anti-Communist League Western Goals, and with Robert Brown. Livingston said, in quotes, "Our world is populated by people who don't enjoy our sensitivities, who don't enjoy our institutions, and quite frankly, mean real harm. We have to roll up our sleeves and do the dark and dirty deeds." Now, remember last week I quoted William Colby, the former CIA director, a gentleman who was on the board of the Nugan Hand Bank that's directly linked to Oliver North and his group. This quotation came out of Covert Action, January 1979, where Colby said, "The greatest threat to America today in the overall relationship is the Third World, that Mexicans are the biggest threat, the most obvious threat. They're breeding from 60 million to 120 million by the end of the century." And Colby said they're becoming increasingly displeased at the gap between our affluence and their poverty. And he goes on to say you could reinforce the borders, but there are not enough bullets to stop them all. So William Colby of the Phoenix Program in Southeast Asia, that worked with all of the Iran-Contra persons in the news practically, except Albert Hakim, who wasn't in Southeast Asia but linked up in Iran, the mentality of Colby is that the Third World is getting displeased between the gap of affluence and their poverty, and they will be a big threat to us. And also Mr. Livingston saying that we have to roll up our sleeves and do dark and dirty business because these people don't enjoy our institutions and mean real harm. So Mr. Livingston was formerly an aide to a congressman. I don't know which one. It doesn't say in this article. He's a former partner of Air Panama and a former power broker until this year with Gray and Company. He advises ABC 2020 program on terrorism. Of course, that's William Casey's Metro Media took over ABC. And he discusses chemical and biological warfare in lectures and gives courses at Georgetown University on terrorism and kidnapping, and he instructs people how to travel around the world not to look American so you're not kidnapped by the Baader-Meinhof or the Japanese Red Brigade. Now, Livingston worked at Robert Gray and Company the same time that Robert Owen worked for them, and Robert Owen is our fourth witness to testify that he left Gray and Company to team up with Adolfo Calero, and that's the time when Robert McFarlane left the National Security to work at home to team up with North and Owen. And his work with Neil Livingston that he mentioned in the hearings is important because Owen was associated, as I say, with John Singlaub, with Robert Brown, with Soldier of Fortune, with the mercenaries that could go out and do the killings. And Mr. Livingston is very open about the necessity to kill leaders of foreign countries. At Gray and Company, Dr. Livingston, as he called himself, with no Ph.D., had his own personal document shredder. He sold guns through a company called Joseph J. Capucci Associates, a security firm for executive protection that they dealt counterterrorism gear through the market of special police force and so forth, with infrared and night lighting devices, silencers, closely monitored by the state and the Defense Department. Livingston lived in Bogota, Colombia. Got it right the third time. He was driven out of the country, suspected by the locals when they said, "Yankee, go home." And he also, when Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981, he expected a position in the government, this Neil Livingston, who worked with North and Owen and Singlaub. His name was floated around for a job on counterterrorism, and instead of getting an appointment above board on counterterrorism, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he went to Robert Keith Gray's office, where Gray was to create an international division of Gray and Company, and he worked for him. Robert Gray needed advice about Libya, and Livingston had also been in Libya and was kicked out as a suspected CIA agent. He was held and released. And as soon as Reagan was in office, Livingston went to work for Gray. Now, the important thing that I mentioned on many broadcasts a while back was that Gray and Company was a takeover from Mullen Associates after Watergate, when Mullen was exposed. In 1972, Mullen and Company represented this blind called Hughes organization when there was no Howard Hughes visible, and they represented Nixon's team, the Watergate plumbers, the persons working inside the basement in the White House for covert operations. Robert Mardian was part of this Watergate team. He was a defendant in the Watergate trials. He was from the Justice Department. He worked on the Inquisition-type grand juries that he set up around this country. And Robert Mardian's attorney for the Watergate hearings and so forth is Mr. Green, who was representing General Secord at the hearings this past week. I'll take a 1-minute break and go into Robert Gray and Watergate in the current events and the same people reappearing on the scene now. This is Mae Brussel, and we just have about 1 more minute for this first half hour, so we'll take a break, and then I'll continue with the interweaving of these people going back to 1972 and even earlier. This is Mae Brussel, and I'm doing the second half hour of World Watchers, program number 806. I mentioned that Robert Owen was the liaison from Adolfo Calero and Mr. John Hull down in Costa Rica to the National Security Council of Oliver North, the president's highest officials out of the NSC, where he'd pick up money for the operations that were illegal. The Congress had said no military aid, so this was done by private individuals. And Robert Owen worked for Robert Gray and his public relations firm before he took off that cloak and switched down to Central America, just as Robert McFarlane worked for the National Security Council, took off that cloak and became a private individual with no apparent salary except his service pay. And Richard Secord, General Secord, retired from the Air Force and took on a private cloak and went to Stanford Technology Training Group, all of them working continuously with the Defense Department and this very special secret pocket inside the government, while all allegedly not getting any salary or assistance from the government, but working with the very highest echelon. Now, Robert Gray's office was a takeover. It was formed after the Watergate disaster. That was the office where G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt and James McCord and the various Watergate teams used that as a cover of a private relations firm while they were in fact paid by the CIA and the White House. And when that office was exposed, Mullen Associates, which was a cover for the entire Hughes organization, although Howard Hughes hadn't been seen physically since 1966, after that was exposed, then Robert Gray's office opened and would be a continuation of the Mullen Associates, only this time Gray and Company. Robert Gray is escorting Rosemary Woods during the Watergate era. She was the secretary of Richard Nixon when the 18-minute gap occurred in the tapes. And also there were entirely 2 tapes were missing totally. And at that time they wanted to bring in Gordon Novell to erase what was on those tapes, but he said they didn't give enough money for it. So the shredding documents, the shredding parties go back to these early periods where a lot of information was destroyed in the committee to re-elect the president. They had their shredding parties, and then in the White House itself to cover up what was going on. Now, part of Mullen Associates that becomes Gray and Company, because Paul Laxalt, the heir apparent to the Hughes Empire, and William Casey, and those persons become very, very close to Gray. And Tom Braden on CNN, you see the gentleman Tom Braden from the left. His wife is an employee of Gray and Company. These offices were the cover for activities of G. Gordon Liddy. And I just started to mention the first half hour that G. Gordon Liddy was closely associated with Robert Mardian, a defendant in the Watergate story, a deputy director of the Justice Department, head of the LEAA, and the terrible grand jury investigations that took place during those times. Mardian and Liddy used to go down the basement and watch Nazi documents and archives of the Gestapo or the activities of Nazi Germany. And when Mardian needed an attorney at the time of Watergate, and there was an attorney to represent the president and the White House at that time, Leonard Garment became the attorney for these Watergate persons in the White House, and he also was the attorney for Alexander Haig. And Leonard Garment was on the stand this past week, for the past 3 days of last week, as the attorney now for Robert McFarlane, the National Security Advisor who formerly worked in the NSC with Henry Kissinger and in the State Department during Alexander Haig. he appeared. And then the attorney, Mr. Green, appeared in the hearings too, and Green was the attorney for General Richard Secord. If Secord comes on again, you'll see Mr. Green. And Green was the attorney for Robert Mardian during these days when Mardian and Sigur and Liddy were living the Odessa, the Nazi Odessa Gestapo activities in mind and in reality. So it's naturally and fitting that Secord's attorney, Secord coming out of an organization originally created by and for Otto von Bolschwing, should have the same attorney that Robert Mardian has, and this is 1987. So, and as I say, Paul Laxalt and William Casey are close to this firm. So the shredding parties are familiar to these people, and the attorneys are familiar to the activities of Watergate that were so carefully concealed by most people, describing the real purposes of Watergate. In 1986, Neil Livingston supervised the Greys' foreign operations, and he was severed he was never charged for a crime, but he was severed because of a scandal with Alejandra Orfia. Many of you remember that, or maybe you don't remember it at all. I'll do some on it later. He was head of the Organization of American States, getting a big salary from them prior to his retirement for several months while he was on the salary of Robert Gray. And then there was a scandal in Madrid where they found that Orfia was involved in paying a legislature to control the elections in Spain. And so the International Division had some problems there, and Livingston severed from these activities. But the time when he was working at Robert Gray, he was working with Mr. Owen, who mentioned him, and he now is active with the Institute for Foreign Policy, and he writes for their newspaper their analysis of terrorism, and he is active as an expert on terrorism and lectures all over the country on how to defend yourself and how to kill. So last week I mentioned the plot to kill Daniel Ortega and the relationship of two men arrested to the office of Representative Philip Crane of Illinois, and Crane is on the board of Western Goals, and John Singlaub on the board of Western Goals escorts Robert Owen to Robert K. Brown, and Singlaub has come right out of the Peregrine Corporation in Dallas, Texas, with the links of persons right up to Caspar Weinberger, and then they in turn go Owen and Singlaub up to Robert Brown, who hires mercenaries who can do killing and assassinations and send death squads to South America. And the tentacles through companies like Peregrine illustrate exactly their links to the Defense Department and how the so-called formers are presently doing the policies of the president, and that is the important thing. I've quoted many times the book Spooks by Jim Hogan, how Robert Brown was conceiving with other persons for a group that would be called the American Volunteer Group on assassination techniques, how Robert Brown was linked with H.L. Hunt, and Lamar Hunt is one of the big funders of the Contra operations, the so-called charity group, and how the AVG could simulate a heart attack that would not be noticeable. A person could have a heart attack, and actually it was a gas gun that would cause them to die. And Robert Brown's name has been alongside of his Soldier of Fortune with all the various knives, books, and information on how to kill and assassinate. So while some people are exposing the plots to kill Daniel Ortega, and some were revealed several years ago with the plans to kill Khomeini, these are the teams, and this is how they sever themselves from different organizations as they move to the next position. And the value of these hearings is that every time a witness gets on the stand, he mentions something that rings a lot of other bells. Now, speaking of bells, a very important person died this past week, just last Monday, James Jesus Angleton, a counter spy for the intelligence community. For one time in this country, he was targeting the lives of Senator Edward Kennedy, a Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, a Democratic candidate, Dr. Martin Luther King, who was murdered, Mary Jo Kopechne, a lady at a party with Ted Kennedy, was murdered, and Angleton was very heavily involved with the John Kennedy assassination in Division 5 of the intelligence community with J. Edgar Hoover. Now, it's an amazing thing that has happened since these hearings have taken place, and granted, these men are old, but there are important people that have died just since February whose names run through all of the stories that I'm telling you and connect with each other. and these heavies have died at this time. I mentioned Mike Burke of the Central Intelligence Agency, who died February the 16th, who was in Hollywood for a while, went to Europe, ran spies for the CIA, managed Ringling Brothers, Barnum Bailey at Madison Square Garden, worked for Gulf and Western, and I did a broadcast on Mike Burke, several of them, regarding Gulf and Western, going back to 1983. This is 4 years ago. And I described Gulf and Western and Charles Bluedorn in their multinational spy network. In the same broadcast, I talked about Edward Lansdale, who died just 1 week after Mike Burke died. And I referred to on broadcast numbers 589, if you happen to want to look it up, Gulf and Western moves quickly to cast a company in his image. This is a article from the Wall Street Journal by Martin S. Davis on Mr. Bluedorn and Gulf and Western, and on the printed sheet that I have with the broadcast, it says Arthur Liman, longtime associate partner in the firm of Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. Paul Weiss, Rifkin, and so forth, set up TCI, Audubon Bolshevik Network, the attorneys for 20th Century Fox, for Marvin Davis, the attorneys for Chris Kraft, for John DeLorean, for the Sterling National Bank, that's the Credit Suisse in Switzerland, where the notorious money for Brunei is missing, and they've been doing the other banking through Credit Suisse, a lot of it, along with that CFR account in Switzerland. And I illustrated in this one article, you might want to look it up, the Wall Street Journal, March 16th, 1983, the links of Gulf and Western to Michele Sindona of the Vatican and to the connections of what I'd refer to as the Reinhard Gehlen Nazi group. And in conjunction with that broadcast, I talked about Mike Burke, this gentleman who just died. And I mentioned him because Burke died February the 16th, Edward Lansdale, February the 25th, Santos Traficante, March the 19th, William Casey, May the 7th, and James Jesus Angleton, May the 13th. These are some very important persons, 5 very important persons who worked with each other. Casey and Angleton were both Knights of Malta from the Vatican, and they worked in operations with the Bay of Pigs and with Southeast Asian drug traffic, with the covert actions of the intelligence community, that the very persons involved with the Iran-Contra affair linked directly to these particular people. And many of the defendants in the Christic Institute lawsuit tie into these operations concerning Mike Burke, Lansdale, Traficante, Casey, and Angleton. So there was a month off in April, but 2 died in February, 1 in March, and 2 in May. And Burke was in the OSS with William Casey. He worked at Warner Brothers for 18 months. He was there in 1945 while Errol Flynn and Ronald Reagan were working there together. In 1949, he went on to Albania. He worked with the CIA inside Poland, Czechoslovakia, and with the Madison Square Garden, and with Sonny Werblin. This was Reagan's early agent in Hollywood. He worked closely with him, and Werblin was part of Gulf and Western. And the broadcast I did 4 years ago is about the connections of Simon, the law office of Simon Rifkin, and Mr. Arthur Liman. And it's interesting, Liman, of course, is one of the chief counsels of the House Intelligence Group, who has been questioning just one day so far. He'll be back. And I listed those connections. Now, Angleton is a person I could do 20 consecutive broadcasts about. I won't do that much, but I have to do a little bit because he set the ground rules. He, with Alan Dulles and William Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, set the ground rules with the fascism from the OSS to the very case of Klaus Barbie that's on trial today. And a chronology of Angleton's role, just briefly, is in that book on Stefano, Delle, Chiaie that I referred to many times. It's by Stuart Christie. It's a very good book, and it's worth owning. It's published by the South End. No, it's from England. I'm sorry. It's published in England. The Anarchy magazine, Refract Publications. And in this chronology, they describe the role where Angleton fits in to the fascism that became American fascism, that is the team behind the Reagan administration. There's an article in the magazine section of the New York Times just this past week called Reagan's Band of True Believers, and it's by Frances Fitzgerald, the woman who wrote Fire in the Lake, American Revisited. She wrote about Southeast Asia. And she goes into the fact that these people have no limits in the White House, that the Reagan people knew that their actions were illegal, but Reagan's people never think that they are, that there's no limits, and she compares them to a cult mentality. Now, Ms. Fitzgerald is almost on the tip of what the cult mentality went into, but it's really that sort of destiny and that Hitlerian gospel and idealism of the pure third, the Aryan nation in the Third Reich that would live 1,000 years. And a lot of that groundwork was set in specific cities and places that can be detailed. And one of them had to do with James Angleton. And the chronology of this book, it begins with this chronology, and it goes then into Mr. Borghese, Count Borghese, who, of course, was a friend of Clay Shaw's and connects to the Kennedy assassination, as does James Angleton. In 1933, in July, the Allies landed in Sicily. And according to this chronology, they were flying Mafia colors. The Mafia wasn't allowed in Italy while Mussolini was in power, and they were anxious to get rid of him in order to get the Mafia going again. In July of 1943, July 25th, 2 weeks later, there were talks between Hitler and Mussolini and King Victor Emmanuel to assume supreme command, and Mussolini was arrested at the time, and they were making arrangements who would run Italy. The fascist party was dissolved 3 days later in Italy, and then Otto Skorzeny, working for Adolf Hitler, this was before the Battle of the Bulge, and he was Hitler's most favorite person. He went on to work for our Central Intelligence Agency and released the Nazi money out of the Swiss bank accounts. Later, kept his offices in Madrid. Otto Skorzeny rescued Mussolini, which pleased Adolf Hitler, and they set up a small republic, a little piece of ground called the Salo Republic, from which Mussolini would work until he was captured and killed. But this is the kind of stronghold we're encouraging the Contras to get in Nicaragua, get a piece of land, hang a flag there, and we'll recognize you, and you'll be the official country. In June 44, and the Battle of the Bulge was in December. This is prior, this is the summer, just beginning the summer, prior to the Battle of the Bulge, which is going to be a complete sellout, where the Americans are to meet with the top Germans at the Rhine. In Italy, the Allies occupied Rome. The command of the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, went to Colonel Clifton T. Carter, an admirer of Marshal Pietro Badoglio, former Italian Army Chief of Staff who led the assault on Ethiopia. Carter's executive officer of the OSS was Major James H. Angleton. He was an expatriate. He lived in Milan, and he sent his son, James Jesus Angleton, who had studied in Italy prior to the war, who had close right-wing fascist connections. He sent his son to Rome to be in charge of the special operations. Now, it's out of Milan that Paul Montini came, described as the Milan Mafia, and it is in Milan, the headquarters of Banco Ambrosiano, that tapped all over the world and has this great amount of missing $1.2 billion in Panama banks at the present time. And Roberta Calvi was in the building of the Banco Ambrosiano in Milan. The headquarters there were run by Major James H. Angleton under the orders of OSS Colonel Clifton Carter, and Angleton had lived in Milan for a long time, and they sent his son James Jesus, who had studied in Italy, to Rome to be head of the special operations of the OSS. And this book says from the moment he arrived in Rome, Angleton established a close contact with fascist and right-wing organizations and the clandestine anti-communist movement, where he recruited his special operations personnel. And this is identical to what happened in Europe with Klaus Barbie, where Americans were using Barbie. The OSS and the CIC would employ Klaus Barbie, and Angleton began to hire the fascists into power in Italy. In the New York Times, along with that other article on the team around Reagan as being a cult, there's also a very good article on Klaus Barbie and how America recruited him in the way that America used Klaus Barbie. That's the Sunday Magazine section, May 10th, 1987. I'll do more on that later, but this is the parallel. The Barbie would work with the Nazis and Americans in Germany and in France, breaking those people who had been in the resistance. And James Jesus Angleton was working with people in Italy who were recruiting agents from the Italian government, persons responsible for invasions and massacres and so forth, to work for the OSS. This book says Angleton became the key American figure controlling all right-wing and neo-fascist political and paramilitary groups in Italy in the post-war period. As in Germany, the U.S. Secret Service involvement with and commitment to the far right during this period facilitated the rebirth of fascism, of the extreme right as the dominant force within Italian politics. One of the numerous terrorist and fascist networks controlled by Angleton had the initials FAR, Fasci di Azione Rivoluzionaria, whose activities included attacks on liberated radio stations and pirate broadcasts then of fascist anthems and pro-Mussolini speeches. An important figure in FAR was Pino Romuldo, an ex-vice secretary of the Salo Republic, where Mussolini was, who said he was the illegitimate son and heir of Mussolini, who became one of the main organizers of the MSI, which included Licio Gelli, who was at Ronald Reagan's inauguration, and people close to George Bush and Ronald Reagan. In report number 86500-3 to the National Security Council, and the NSC was formed by 1947, this was prepared by James Angleton himself. All the clandestine anti-communist organizations are listed, and the author confirms that these are financed by the United States Secret Services into the hands of James Angleton. Angleton had great stress on the importance of the Armata Italiana dei Liberazione, AIL, that was led by Colonel Musso and General Sorrisi, the former Minister of War in the government of Marshal Badoglio. In report 86500-7747, they report that they have 50 generals in the process of organizing any coup d'etat, and they will fight the anti-communists, and by December 1944, December the 8th, and this is when the Battle of Bulge was taking place in Germany, the Malmedy confrontation of American troops with the Germans, when Fritz Kramer, Hitler's General Fritz Kramer, was later put as a prisoner for ordering the massacre of Americans, and a General Fritz Kramer was there with Henry Kissinger. At that time, simultaneously with that, James Angleton was working in December 44 with British and American military. They were signing a secret accord in Rome that proposed that Allied financial aid and arms shipments would go to the Committee for National Liberation of Upper Italy, and in return for the agreement that they would guard northern industrial plants from the Germans and stage a rapid disarmament and liberation, that they would take over the government of Italy quickly, and the main British figure in negotiations with the anti-communist partisans during this period was a mysterious man named John McCaffrey of the Special Intelligence Service M16, who operated under the cover of being a press attaché to the British legation in Bern, Switzerland, where Allen Dulles was located. And McCaffrey and Edgar Leslie of M16, also placed in Bern, were closely with Allen Dulles of the OSS. And there was a lot of opposition by the British government, but what they were saying was they would sign a secret accord and quickly take over from where the Germans are, get a rapid disarmament, in quotes, liberate them. And John McCaffrey and Edgar Leslie of M16 would be working with Allen Dulles, and they set up a team that were accused later of working with a conspiracy of a cabal of disenchanted Prussian generals. Translated means Nazis from the Eastern Front that they were working with. December 27, 1944, journalist Guglielmo Gianni founds a newspaper called The Common Man, an extreme right-wing paper directed to the reactionary middle class, based on fascist sympathizers, monarchists, and persons from the Salo Republicans, where Mussolini had been staying. They set up espionage operations and operations for the end of a continuation of what really is the fascism that took place in Italy to replace Mussolini after the war. Now, I had this on the air, a lot of this material, going back to broadcast 622, I believe, or 624, which was 3 years ago. But again, there are new listeners, and this is important to know about the role of Angleton, because he then goes on to be in charge of the Israeli desk in the Mossad, and that's where Mr. Nimrodi and Nir and Michael Ledeen connect through James Angleton's work in the Middle East and in Washington in the CIA. Now, there are documents, according to this book, that provide evidence of close links between the Italian fascists and the Roman Catholic Church. This document advises the OVRA agents, Mussolini's secret police, to infiltrate all the Communist Party, the National Liberation Committees, and in April of 45, and the war would officially be over in May, Admiral Ellery Stone, who became a Knight of Malta, the U.S. proconsul in occupied Italy, instructed James Angleton that he was to rescue Prince Valerio Borghese from the possibility of arrest by the Resistance Committee. The Resistance Committees had sentenced Borghese to death for the war crimes. Stone was a close friend of Borghese's, Stone from the Vatican and from the United States. The Black Prince, he was referred to Borghese, and his name is in the telephone directories of Clay Shaw, and was part of the Permandex operation set up in Rome later in the late 50s. That was the operational organization for murdering heads of states, and one of those people that was murdered was John Kennedy. So Angleton had the job of rescuing Borghese, which he did, and some people thought of him as a wartime hero. His frogmen and his submarines and so forth were blowing up American ships. So in April 45, just 2 weeks, April 29th, about 10 days before the war was over, Angleton, with Captain Carlo Recia of Italian Navy Intelligence, collected Prince Borghese from his hiding place in Milan, apartment just exactly near where James Angleton's father was all these years, or where the Banco Ambrosiano would be set up with Roberta Calvi. He was dressed in the uniform of a U.S. officer and escorted to Rome. Reinhard Gehlen, the chief of Hitler's intelligence, of course, was dressed as a U.S. officer and taken to the United States. And this chronology in the book title is called Stefano Delle Chiaie. He's the defendant in the bombing cases that's taking place in Italy right now, and he worked very closely with James Angleton and Prince Borghese, and with the hard right, not only right-wing, but outright fascist Nazis. Many who should have been tried and killed were allowed to live and spread their disease of teaching how to kill and setting up death squads and working with the American intelligence. In this book, Stefano Delle Chiaie, there's a picture of Valerio Borghese, who Angleton helped release, and had chosen him in his uniform, and under his direction he was responsible for the torture and mass murder of Italian partisans. So he was taken to Rome and was protected by the very factors that were working in other countries to do the same thing. This book says, to the threat of communism, France organized small, efficient police cells outside the police structure under the supervision of special persons in the government, and these cells were equipped with money and trained to perfection. And in Italy, the same thing was going. They were secret anti-communist police groups, and these same little cells are the kind that North and Secord and Hakim and Robert Owen and many others belong to in this country, only instead of trying after a long struggle to kill the resistance are being killed off by death squads in this country. That's what the AVG group is. Robert Brown and Lamar Hunt and the former Marines and the Minutemen is to kill people in this country who would oppose fascism as it goes along the way and wipe them out. According to this book on Stefano Delle Chiaie, these little teams rounded up and arrested these persons who were charged to be communists in the anti-anarchist group. They killed 62 people that they admitted, 40 of them members of the Communist Party. This was after the war in 1948. Over 3,000 were injured, over 93,000 were arrested, 92,000, and many of them that were killed were those that were working for the resistance movement to get rid of fascism. There was a Pedrino Belgrado who was tried and for his crime of anti-fascist activities, and he was imprisoned for 30 years because he was an anti-fascist. And this book continues on the role of U.S. Secret Service agents Peter Baru, Daniel McCarthy, Dr. Trudeau under James Angleton. The MSI began a massive program of expansion, and by 1948 they had 1,874 branches. They controlled 34 weekly magazines. They established covert organizations, and they had ex-servicemen from the Italian government and from Mussolini, and they launched their daily reports and became a real power in Europe that began sabotaging and killing persons that looked to be leftists, and they referred to themselves as the White Guards, whose duty was to keep under observation any groups advocating disobedience, embryonic form of sabotage to combat progressive poisoning of minds, prevent the weaker members from society from being influenced by hostile propaganda, to prevent the appointment of communists to positions of authority, and to thwart criminal solidarity. I think that was broadcast 665 that I shared that with you. James Angleton was behind the formation of these groups, and then, of course, it goes into 1960 when the groups that he set up began working with persons like Stefano, Delle, Chiaie. John McCaffrey, the man who recruited Angleton, before his death made out an affidavit that he plotted with Michele Sindona in an attempt to overthrow the Italian government. And the very people whose names are making history in our current time worked even before the war was over, from 1943 and 44, setting the network, as I've said many times, for persons who are active in our political campaigns in this country at the present time. There's a picture in this book of Carlo Presenti, a famous cement manufacturer and insurance tycoon, backer of the Italian fascists, and head of the MSI, the hardliners. And there's a gentleman called Luigi Turchi, Turchi, who was one of the mainstays of the committee to re-elect the president of Richard Nixon, who worked with G. Gordon Liddy and Robert Mardian, and he was part of the 1972 re-election campaign, a guest of honor at the official reception to celebrate Nixon's re-election as president. Well, my time is up. I can't even begin to touch the career of Angleton, but he goes from 1943 and fascism, and he made a Knight of Malta by the Vatican, to having people in the committee to re-elect the president, and those people are working today with the Iran-Contra affair, and parts of their contacts are being made visible through their testimony. This is Mae Brussel, and I'll be continuing more about the hearings and their connections to the fascists of the past and present. In the meantime, thank you for letters and books you've been sending and articles, and I'll try to answer you as soon as I can. The important thing about the Iran-Contra affair is that young people that come along, such as Ollie North and Robert Owen, who are the young ones, tap right into the network that was set up before World War II is over, and I will want to emphasize that as the hearings develop.